Mi arrivano notizie che qualcuno vorrebbe preparare la festa di laurea. Mandiamo i carabinieri, ma li mandiamo con i lanciafiamme.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernick, the Great is Silent, and today we are talking about Gianfranco Fini, the heir of Almirante, founder of Alleanza Nazionale and the face of the far right in Italy's Second Republic. This episode will also be the final one of Historical November. For the past month I've made 4 particularly long episodes that required an above average amount of research. The few that watched them seem to enjoy them, judging by the good amount of likes per view, so thank you very much. Fini may not be particularly wacky, but his story is quite engaging, and it says a lot about the role of the far right from the 90s up until relatively recently. So let's begin. Fini was born in Bologna in 1952. When he was 16, he joined the youth group of the Italian Social Movement, a party that was openly nostalgic to fascist Italy. The MSI was indirectly responsible for multiple terrorist attacks and directly responsible for the riots in Genoa in 1960 during Tambroni's government. The party had about 2 currents, one led by Giorgio Almirante, the conservative one, who wanted a presidential system, and Arturo Michelini, the more authoritarian one, who liked to taunt the communists into making riots that they could use as an excuse to beat them up and eventually topple the democratic system. Little homework before we move on. Watch these 2 videos, they will make Fini's background a lot clearer. In 1977, Almirante made him president of the Youth Front, a charge he kept until 1988, when his master sadly passed. Almirante's last wish for the party was to assign its leadership to someone young, not fascist, not nostalgic, and that believed in the democratic institutions. And so, Fini succeeded him to the dismay of the more authoritarian current of the party, who was now facing someone even more moderate than his predecessor. Things were rough at the beginning, since Fini had a hard time living up to Almirante's legacy. Despite his relatively more moderate views, Fini was still far right. He was conservative and nationalist, but it wasn't enough to win over the neo-fascist voter base. He needed to be based. According to the Urban Dictionary, based is a word used when you agree with something. So for example, for a libertarian, not paying taxes is based, while for a communist, removing currency is based. However, when I say based, I am ironically referring to what super far-right individuals that don't go outside much would consider based, which is generally stuff like sexism, homophobia, racism, and anime. Therefore, when I say that Fini required to be based, I mean that he went wild with the shitposting and the simping of Mussolini. Here are some of his best quotes in the early 90s. Feel free to read them while I put some suitable music. Despite his horrendously outdated takes, he was still able to attract new voters that came from conservative or religious backgrounds that didn't have any feelings of respect towards fascism whatsoever. The death of the Italian social movement and its transformation into the National Alliance was characterized by a gradual abandonment of the values of a long-dead regime and on the more active interest on the Italian territory, the traditions that were still widespread, and of course the birth of modern Italian patriotism. I like to think that Fini really earned his place in public consciousness at the very beginning of the Second Republic. In 1993, most of the big cities in Italy were voting for their new mayors, and since the Christian Democrats had lost a lot of face back then due to the corruption trials going on at the time, many of the right-wing candidates were actually from the Italian social movement. The elections in Rome were particularly unique because they saw Fini, a far-right nationalist, compete against Francesco Rutelli, a far-left libertarian from the Radicali. Related to this event is Berlusconi's first ever appearance on TV where he expressed a political opinion. During this historical event, he claimed that if he lived in Rome, he would vote for Fini. Fast forward to 5 months later and boom, they are political allies. The 1994 elections saw the center-right alliance beating the left out of the blue and Berlusconi becoming prime minister for about a year. Despite it being the first ever government with at least one far-right minister, Fini didn't get any position, which is a bit of a shame since that cabinet is probably one of the wackiest in Italian history. I'd love to talk about it if this video gets 30 likes. Fini will become deputy prime minister in 2001 after Berlusconi won the elections once again. This time his government coalition will be much stronger and have a more developed electoral plan that will give it enough stability to stay put for an entire 5-year-long legislation. During his time in government, Fini is credited for many laws. One of the most famous is the Bossi-Fini law, which deals with illegal immigration. It was made after 2004, when Fini became foreign minister and tried his best to try and solve the issue of illegal immigration, which wasn't as bad as it was in 2015. The law is still active to this day, and it introduced harsher penalties to human traffickers, the expulsion for whoever is caught crossing the border illegally, and the introduction of a residence permit for when immigrants are called in the country to work. Overall, it is a good law in theory if you exclude the fact that it is a bit hard to enforce, especially considering that today most of the people sailing into Italy legally come from very far away countries, so sending them all back is basically impossible. Plus, I think it goes in contrast with European asylum regulations, so yeah, a new law should be made, I think. Fini is also responsible for the Fini-Giovanardi law about drugs, basically removing all distinctions between soft and hard drugs, and introducing a series of penalties for whoever was caught consuming them. Punishments included the suspension of the passport, the suspension of the driving license or the prohibition to obtain it, as well as the suspension of the firearms license, which is a bit harsh. The law is no longer applied after the Constitutional Court deemed it unconstitutional in 2006, not only because the penalties didn't fit the crimes, but also because it wasn't clear on the matter of production for personal use. From 2005 onwards, Fini started to seriously strip the party off of all the neo-fascists and the people who didn't like him. This went on until 2008, when in order to beat Prodi at the elections, Forza Italia and Alleanza Nazionale merged into one big party, the People of Freedom. The fusion worked and Berlusconi won the elections once again, becoming prime minister for a third time. Fini will be elected president of the Chamber of Deputies, a very important position that he will use to voice his gradually more progressive opinions. Over the years, he will become more tolerant towards the European Union, abortions, gay marriage, and even going as far as to be open about allowing legal immigrants to vote, even without a citizenship. Eventually, Fini became even more left-wing than Berlusconi, and he went as far as to question him openly. Unfortunately for Fini though, all the people he had kicked out of Alleanza Nazionale that didn't like him had just moved to Forza Italia, and so it was much harder for him to really challenge Berlusconi as a leader of the party. At first the critiques were private, but then during the party congress of the 22nd of April 2010, Berlusconi called Fini out in front of a live audience and told him that if he wanted to comment on his politics, he should resign from his position. When faced with such humiliation, Fini asked Berlusconi, "What are you doing? Are you kicking me out? But Berlusconi didn't even identify him with an answer. It will go all down from there on for Fini. Most of his supporters left him in favor of Berlusconi that day. He will leave the coalition along with just a few of his most loyal followers shortly after and never be elected again. Ignazio La Russa, one of the most notable former followers of Fini, commented the events of that fateful day like this: "I would have followed Fini that night, but he had become a centrist." And that being said, I feel like that sums up everything perfectly. Fini is the Italian personification of the famous phrase, "Go woke, go broke." He got so invested into dragging his party into something more compatible with the future that he forgot to appeal to a voter base, which is a shame, because at the beginning he was able to double the average votes that his master used to get. While I do find Fini fascinating and I appreciate him for his openness to new ideas, I think he ran too fast. It pains me to say this, but a good portion of the Italian people still holds conservative values. That's why Salvini and Meloni's catchphrases are so effective. So what he ended up doing was to suck himself out of the political power vacuum that he had created. The lack of a far-right party at the 2013 elections was filled only recently with Giorgia Meloni, the founder of Brothers of Italy, which contains all the national conservatives that had abandoned Fini back then, except for a few exceptions that are still associated with Berlusconi. Meloni is in many ways Fini's protégé, but instead of learning from his teachings, Meloni really seems to have learned from his mistakes. In fact, she is more conservative than ever. Maybe a bit too much, but that's beside the point. Fini is currently enjoying his retirement and hasn't been doing much. In one of his latest interviews, he described Meloni as a bit too full of herself and that she may not have a long future ahead of her. But considering that this was said in 2015, I really don't think his words hold much weight anymore. That being said, thank you guys for watching. What do you think about Fini? Let me know in the comments below. I will see you next time.